Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Do Your Research. I'm Michael,
And I'm Carl.
and this is a podcast.
That it is.
Yes, that it is.
Although perhaps we should be a little more specific about what kind of podcast it is today.
I think you're right. I think that lovely little takedown notice that we got on our last video from our good friends over at YouTube,
As our
uh,
viewer will know.
as our one viewer will know, yeah, we maybe need to give a little bit of an explanation as about what the purpose of our podcast is, so that when we're talking about these conspiracies and things that are out there in the zeitgeist, we don't get mistaken for actually promoters, being promoters of these theories.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
exactly. The purpose of what we're doing here is to look and analyze different conspiracy theories and misinformation that's out there on the internet, and actually do what uh, you know cynical people on the internet always tell us to do when they're promoting these conspiracy theories, and that's do your research. So we are doing our research. We are doing
Yes.
fact-based research. We are really diving deep into these topics that are both interesting and fascinating. Oftentimes, way more interesting than the actual conspiracy theories themselves is the actual truth behind all of this stuff. So that's what we're doing here. We're sitting down with you. We are analyzing different subjects and topics. Some sensational, some not as sensational, but important.
Yeah. Yeah, to your point, our plan had been that our content thus far would be the bulk of our content, specifically looking at conspiracies and debunking them. But
Hmm.
as with our planned topic today, sometimes branching out into less conspiratorial items, but still not to promote the bull,
No,
to
not at
debunk the
all.
bull.
To debunk the bull, promote the truth. That's
Yeah.
what we're here for. So we're going to get that out of the way up top, so anybody that is looking at any potential appeal of any of these videos can hear this and understand, like, here's what we're trying to do. So
Yes.
with any luck, we'll get that other video back. YouTube will take an actual look at it and go, oh, these guys aren't promoting 5G coronavirus conspiracy theories. These guys are actually talking about how bullshit they are. So
Yes.
yeah, anyway. All
Yeah,
right.
that's the
Well, business
goal.
out of the way. Carl, we're recording this on the very last day of 2020, and god damn, what a year it's been.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank goodness tomorrow is the 1st of January and everything will just magically be better and different
That's
tomorrow.
that's what I keep being told. Yes,
Yeah.
everything will be
Yeah.
better in 2021. Yeah, somehow I doubt that, but yeah, 2020 has been 2020 has been a rough year. If you had to pick the worst thing about 2020, Carl, what would you pick to be your number one worst thing?
I mean, I know the lead in you're trying to give me, and even though the answer is pretty obvious in terms of global things that have affected us globally, I think even then and I'll say it in a second, but even then, it's still a hard sell because there's been a bunch of shit happen in 2020 that will have echoes for decades to come that I think may well be much worse in the long term. But obviously, why COVID-19, Michael?
Yes, the deadly pandemic that we may have mentioned in passing in some of our other videos. You didn't have to actually pick that. I was just checking to see if maybe you had something worse. But yeah,
I
COVID
mean,
19.
there's the degrading of confidence in democracy globally and specifically in the US. There's the rampant militarization of radicals in otherwise historically stable nations, again,
Hmm.
including the United States. There's the utter perversion of the process of nominating justices and the last decade of inaction from our legislature because of a Senate majority leader that has utterly abdicated his responsibility for addressing the problems and concerns facing the nation and refusing to pass any legislation or even bring it to a vote. There's a bunch of shit. But
Uh-huh.
for 2020 specifically, definitely COVID 19.
I would say that I think it's worse in the way that it has killed more people than perhaps the any of these awful, terrible political things that have gone on. But we'll see. I mean,
Oh,
there's
yeah, no,
still
those are all
time.
problems for decades down the road as they kill, just tens of thousands a year instead of
Hmm.
hundreds of thousands in 1 year.
And tear apart the moral and political fabric of society. But yeah, here we are. Well,
2020.
2020. Good thing it'll all be fixed tomorrow. Well, anyway, Carl, as our astute listeners may have guessed, our topic that we were going to be discussing today is, in fact, the SARS-CoV-2 novel
Yeah,
coronavirus, also known as COVID-19.
and more specifically, the vaccine. And this was your suggestion, but
Yeah.
that we would cover today. I mean, yeah, a couple episodes back, we covered some conspiracies and clear bullshit about the vaccine and implantable technologies and whatnot. But today, we wanted to take a look at there's a lot of vaccine skepticism, and
Hmm.
as we've said, it's not unreasonable that people are skeptical in the face of all of this information that's out there and misinformation that's out there, and the fact that this vaccine was developed extraordinarily
Hmm.
quickly, and
Very fast.
there's politicization of all sorts of stuff around it. So there's people that are skeptical, and all of that skepticism is not unreasonable. So we wanted to take a look and show why, even though it's happened very quickly, the vaccine is still dependable. Or, maybe we would have
Yeah.
found it wasn't in the course of our research, but I didn't. I don't
Yeah,
know.
spoiler alert. Yeah.
Yeah.
It turns out that the FDA and WHO and other world health, bodies are not trying to kill us all with any crazy nonsense. They're really doing what their job is supposed to be, and helping us. And in this case, as we will articulate in this podcast, they did it very, very quickly.
Yeah. Who'd have thunk they weren't badly written comic book supervillains that were just trying to kill everyone?
I mean, I guess maybe some people might find that more interesting, but hopefully, as our listeners will, you know, value the more interesting information behind the actual facts rather than the sensationalist nonsense behind conspiracy theories.
Yes. Now, as always, though, we like to start off by kind of defining our terms, though we're,
Yes.
well, as always, on this, our fifth occasion of recording a podcast, I'd like to also start out by defining our terms. So, Michael, I think for the sake of our listeners, a succinct definition of COVID 19?
Yeah. So, yeah, COVID-19 or coronavirus disease 2019 is a contagious disease caused by severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 or SARS-CoV-2, which is a mouthful. Um, First case was identified in Wuhan, China, in December 2019, and it has since spread worldwide, leading to an ongoing worldwide pandemic that we've all been suffering through for almost an entire year now.
In case any of our listeners have missed that. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
any of our listener has missed that.
Hey, I might listen back to this, and if you might, then that's two of us.
That's
So,
two.
plural.
So, thank you very much, Michael. What we're going to look at today is first, we'll talk a little bit more about why we thought it was very important to look at why this vaccine can be trusted and is
Yeah.
reliable, despite all of the some of the political shenanigans and rhetoric surrounding it. We want to take a look at sort of the history of vaccine development, which you're going to cover. Then
Hmm.
we'll look at sort of how the process and timeline was adjusted with this vaccine in order to make this extraordinarily feat of science and global cooperation possible, which I'll be looking into. And then some of the technological developments that also allowed this to go so quickly. Then you're going to take a look at some of the testing and procedural modifications that, again, allowed the development of this vaccine to occur so rapidly. And then I'll be taking a look at sort of what the vaccine we've ended up with is,
Hmm.
and again, why that is trustworthy. I guess, or not trustworthy, but again, spoilers,
Yeah.
trustworthy.
Uh, yeah. Yeah, and a good part of the reason we did this research was I was really interested in the speed of this. I know you were too.
Oh, absolutely. It's
It's great
remarkable.
for remarkable and great for peace of mind, and really instills in you well, we can kind of go over how I feel
Yeah.
about it at the end,
In the
but yeah,
face of this horrible, horrible, horrible year and all of the terrible things that have happened because of the actions of humans
yeah,
solely, we also have this remarkable example of what humanity can accomplish in curing a disease that could have been an ongoing disaster for a well, treating and
hmm
hopefully creating an immune response to a disease that could have
yeah,
been a disaster for decades to come because of a global effort and global cooperation and a culmination of research of previous decades that just all came together to make this possible. And
yeah.
it's really awesome. I mean,
It really is. So I, I could dive into a whole history of vaccines themselves, but
before we get into that though, I do just want to point out the why we thought it was really important to talk about this in the end. And
yes,
that comes down to herd immunity. Now,
mm,
I would like to be very specific, and perhaps this is a topic we can discuss in another episode, but I am not talking about the magical development of herd immunity by allowing every person to contract a disease that kills potentially 1% of the people who get it, and the millions upon millions of deaths that would result. I mean, the actual strategy to achieve herd immunity, which is vaccine assisted herd immunity, the
right,
kind that hopefully involves less mass death. Um, and because to achieve that, we need pretty high vaccination rates. Recently, Anthony Fauci has come out and said we're looking to get rates close to or at about 90%. That statement has occurred since we did our research, so
hmm
I don't have that validated or know what that came through, but I believe the statement was about that. But even in best case scenarios, we need to achieve herd immunity based on my extreme layman application of the formula, which is
hmm
linked in my sources that will be linked. We would need for a 100% effective vaccine, a perfectly effective vaccine, a 60 to 72% vaccination slash immunity rate to achieve herd immunity. And based on a 95% effective rate, more like 63.16 to 75.19%. That, again, layman applying the formula to get that. But sources for population data and formulas are linked in the
yeah.
documents.
So if I can scroll that back just a tiny bit, if what you're saying is we need to have a immunization rate of the adult population somewhere around 63%.
So as a layman, I'm not entirely sure if it was talking about it was a very long academic paper,
Sure.
and I didn't understand all of it. But there was a section about the formula and how they determined it, and it was not clear to me based on the verbiage they used if they meant immune rate or I'm
Mm,
fairly certain. Actually, I'm gonna just open it because
yeah.
yeah, I wasn't. I needed to verify that that was not just immunity rates, but was vaccination rates.
hmm
So yes, that is vaccination rates.
So vaccination rate, a 63% vaccination rate is what we would need to have in order to have herd immunity for a 95% effective vaccine.
63.19 on the low end to 75.19
75.
vaccination rate for a 95% effective vaccine. That does not take into account a number of things that an actual virologist or expert like Anthony Fauci could take into account when he gives us that 90% rate.
hmm
Um, but that's just like very base number, not adjusted. But even at that much lower number than the 90% rate, that does not leave us a lot of room for error. People may know that the current vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer both, are not currently approved for children 16 years of age or younger.
hmm
So that's a pretty hefty chunk of the population that already cannot be vaccinated.
Right. At this point.
Yes, in 2019, at ages 17 or younger, there were 73 million children. Those numbers seem to be distributed roughly evenly by age. So 16 or younger We are looking at somewhere between 68.7 and 69 million people in our
Hmm.
country of 331 million that already can't get the vaccine. That's already 20.7% of the population.
Hmm.
That already takes us below 80%. On the low end, that means we only have, of people who are able to get the vaccine but may choose not to, somewhere between a 4.05 or 16% window
Mm.
of people we can afford to not get the vaccine and still achieve herd immunity based on my layman numbers. That is not based on Anthony Fauci's 90% number, which he may have been talking about the adult population. That would make
Sure.
sense, right?
Certainly. And I think it's important to point out too that we're saying, that children under 16 aren't approved for the vaccine, and that's not because anybody believes that the vaccines are in some way dangerous to children. It's because they haven't been tested on children.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
They haven't
Thank
gone
you.
through
That's
the
a good
clinical
call out.
trials. Right.
Yeah, which is something we can cover a lot more in subsequent sections on testing and approvals. But yes, they are not approved for 16 or younger because they've been shown to be harmful or because anyone expects that they would be, only
Hmm.
because testing hasn't taken place. And even in the face of a pandemic, we still tested this thing,
Right.
unlike, say,
Exactly.
Russia or China.
And same goes with pregnant women too. I think it's also a good thing to point out, and that's just typically because of liability and other things that go along with clinical trials in general. They don't start with those populations that most would consider vulnerable populations.
Yeah, you don't add extra compounding risk factors on purpose in your early testing. You
Right.
test it on the largest a sample that is as representative of as large a chunk of the population as you can in order to approve it for as large a chunk of the population as you can in order to start rolling it out as quickly as possible.
Exactly right. And that is what happened in this case. So, I think the main kind of focus of this podcast was, centered kind of around the concern that this approval and this vaccine development happened really fast. Like we mentioned
Yeah.
that before, but we have never in the history of humanity developed a vaccine from a new virus or new disease that we have never seen before so quickly. We as of the start of, I'll get into a little bit of the timeline of how this coronavirus kind of came about and how it became a pandemic. But I mean, we are looking at less than a year before the actual onset of the global pandemic to having multiple vaccines to immunize against it, which is a
Yeah.
huge feat.
It's remarkable. But fortunately, as we'll find, and despite the history section that you're getting ready to cover,
Yeah,
um, fast does not mean haphazard or rushed.
very true. So I've got a whole long timeline that I've got posted up that will be in the notes. So on January 9th, the WHO announces a mysterious coronavirus related pneumonia in Wuhan, China. And there have been reports coming out of China as early as I think we said December 19th of 2019. Um, but the
Okay.
WHO first really kind of said, okay, here, we think we've got a real problem. And then on January 21st, my birthday of this year, the CDC confirmed the very first coronavirus case in the United States.
You have the same birthday as coronavirus.
In the U.S., yeah, I know. Which I mean, more than likely it was here much sooner, but that was the first reported case confirmed by the CDC, and that was up in Seattle.
Hmm.
Um, in February 3rd, the U.S. declared a public health emergency, and then on March 11th, the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic.
Okay.
Um, so I will say this: there's a lot of things that I can criticize. You and I both can criticize about the Trump administration and our Congress, but at least in this case, they did act relatively quickly in response to this, at least as far as how government goes. March 26th, the Senate passed the CARES Act, and this really kicked off not only pandemic payments to Americans, small businesses. We had started going into lockdowns at this point in some parts of the country, closing up businesses, restricting movement of people, mandating mask wearing, social distancing, all of that. But another important part of the CARES Act was that it allocated $100 billion, yeah, $100 billion to what was called $10 billion to Operation Warp Speed, and this was the initial funding of that. It had gotten in place around April and then was officially announced by the Trump administration on May 15th of 2020. And so what Operation Warp Speed did, this is a really kind of key point to how and why we were able to move so quickly in the development of a vaccine, because we started dumping money into it. Uh, Normally, and we'll get into this a little bit, but vaccine development is usually a much longer process, partially because of funding. Um,
Large part,
a large part costs a lot
almost
of money.
predominantly.
It costs a lot of money to develop vaccines, because you're dumping a whole bunch of money into research and development that you don't know is going to pay off. And so
Yes.
getting investors to, put money into the development of any sort of medicine or drug is a risk. In this case, we eliminated that risk by saying, here's $10 billion, companies. Anybody that's developing a vaccine or any sort of treatment or testing or therapies, you can have access to this fund of money that we'll be giving you to jumpstart your research and development process on this. So very, very good. We backslid a little bit. I mean, in May 28th, I think our U.S. COVID-19 deaths passed 100,000, uh, which seems like a very small number now. I mean, we're well over 300,000 now in this country. Um,
340.
340, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and
10,000 just in like the last week.
Good Lord. Thankfully, I mean, we had that big spike after Thanksgiving. Looks like things are trending back downwards now, which is really great with some hope in sight as far as the vaccines go.
Though
Um,
Christmas and New Year's.
yeah, still have to happen. Um, but very quickly after Operation Warp Speed was announced, these companies that were working on these vaccines, I think we'll talk a little bit about them, like AstraZeneca, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson also has one. Um, those start putting out kind of promising results around July of this year. And during this time, the FDA is kind of granting emergency use authorization to other drugs and treatments. Some of them work, some of them don't. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about what exactly is an emergency use authorization. That's going to be hard for me to say. I don't know why I keep saying emergency youth. Yeah, that's not emergency use authorization. Emphasis on the oosh, oos. I'll get it one of these days. So on let's see, August 11th, I think this is another really good point to point out, is the Trump administration reached a deal with Moderna. Still awaiting final data on how promising their vaccine was, but the vaccine looked like it was coming on well enough. Initial results were really promising. So they paid $1.5 billion for 100 million doses of the vaccine, uh, at about roughly $15 per dose. Now, the vaccine hadn't been approved yet. It hadn't been, given emergency use authorization yet. But and we're kind of hedging our bets a little bit to make sure that we can have vaccines available when and if they become authorized. So again, around September 3rd of this year, Pfizer BioNTech expands their phase 3 trials of their vaccine. September 21st, Johnson and Johnson begins their phase 3 vaccine trial. And then, sadly, on September 28th, the global COVID-19 death surpassed 1 million. So in less than a year, the coronavirus was responsible for killing 1 million people worldwide. And I think, we have a hard time as human beings grasping large numbers, conceptualizing them. 1 million, you
Yeah.
know, we know it's a lot, but I, it's one of these things that it's 1 million people who may not have died otherwise. Other than this. So people that try to downplay this, which I still see a lot of that around. Oh, it's not so bad. It's not a big deal. The anytime you have deaths like this, it's a tragedy for the people that know and care about them. And I want to say that even though we might be, you know, kind of just throwing these out there as in big numbers, the actual human toll of this virus has been staggering. People's
Yeah.
lives have been changed forever because of this illness. So, um, even if we might make some jokes here and there, I want to make sure that it's very clear that we're not downplaying the actual human toll that this virus has taken.
It's gallows humor, not
Yeah,
minimalization of this abject human tragedy.
very much so. So, all right, and then the less well, initially after that, I guess it's not funny, but it was kind of a oh wow, finally on October 2nd, Trump and First Lady Melania Trump test positive for COVID-19.
Oh
Trump
no,
goes
it's
to the
funny.
hospital.
It's hilarious. It's okay to say it's hilarious. We're not
He
we're
put
not we're not advocating for a person to get a disease. We're talking about a man who had downplayed precautions, had encouraged people to resist their state measures after claiming he was in favor of the states handling it, then encouraging people to resist it, who had described masks as a personal choice he wouldn't be making, and who had held rallies in places where local government said those sorts of large gatherings couldn't happen or shouldn't happen. And I mean, he caused many people to get sick. So it's okay to think it's funny that a man who flaunted precautionary measures and chose to avoid them at all costs because I don't, who fucking knows why, got it. Yeah. It's
yeah,
okay if you
yeah,
feel schadenfreude from that.
yeah, and I think didn't he also kind of suggest that people inject bleach too to cure themselves of the coronavirus?
Well, yes. I mean, that will be defended because he didn't explicitly say inject bleach, but I would argue that the most generous interpretation of that conversation is that this man who lacks profound understanding of what is possible thought he could add some value by spitballing with actual expert virologists in the middle of a fucking press conference when it was entirely inappropriate, like he'd somehow give them a light bulb moment of, oh, we didn't think about injecting something to kill the virus.
Ugh.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's important to say that despite having real no leadership at all from the executive branch, or at least no helpful leadership, all this stuff still got done despite the efforts of Donald Trump, um, which I'm sure he of course didn't want this pandemic. But I mean, I guess that's another topic for this. I think it would have been very
Yeah.
easy for him to
He
be
certainly went with the
reelected.
strategy of trying to ignore it and pretend it wasn't happening.
Yeah, bury his head in the sand and just pretend like it's not a big deal when he
I
knew it
believe
actually
his quote
was.
when 200,000 people had died was, "It is what it is."
Fuck that guy. Uh,
Okay. But,
yeah. Anyway,
sorry, we've
back to
diverged.
my timeline. No, that's totally okay. He didn't die, by the way. If anybody's reading this from the future, he got access to all sorts of very very expensive world class drugs and things that hadn't been officially released to the public yet, and he got better.
Things that likely literally wouldn't have been available to anyone other than a head of state. I mean,
Yeah.
things that likely, even with Jeff Bezos money, you might not have
Hmm.
been able to buy access.
Yeah, I guess it was in our national security for the president not
Oh
to
yeah,
die of
yeah,
a
no,
virus that.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
no.
yeah,
He should have got them. He is still the president technically.
yeah, yeah. Herman Cain died from it, though, of course, from one of his attending one of Trump's rallies.
And
That
then tweeted after he died.
oh yeah, no, his team is also actively trying to downplay. We're getting off topic. Sorry, it's been awful the way that some of our leadership has tried to manage, quote unquote, uh, this pandemic in this country. But thankfully, we have some very very competent drug companies that you know were able, and very smart people working for those companies.
Fuck me, talking about how great Pfizer is. Jesus Christ.
I mean,
Fuck.
yes. Yeah, I guess that's another kind of good point to bring up is that like just because we're praising their efforts in this case, doesn't mean that we fully support or condone everything these companies have done. Because, uh, yeah, drug companies in this country are extremely problematic.
Yeah, to
Yeah,
say the least. Yeah, like
yeah,
hours of topic there too, but not for
yeah.
today.
Not
Just
for
the
today. We'll
caveat of we're just talking about how they did with this.
hmm and we'll talk about we can celebrate at least some of the good that they have done for this country and the world in this case. November 4th of this year, just last month, uh, we hit 100,000 cases in a day in this country. We really started spiking up again. November 16th, Moderna, uh, drug company Moderna and Pfizer, both revealed their vaccine efficacy results, and that they are 94.5% effective in participants who received the vaccine in preventing infection of coronavirus. These were both mRNA
Yay.
vaccines, which I know you'll talk about a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
fascinating.
so cool. And in their clinical trials, they came out to be almost 95% effective. And that same day, the FDA said it's going to move quickly to do emergency use authorizations for both Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines.
Yes.
And I actually watched it was kind of like a roundtable public comment slash committee discussion
Okay.
about a bunch of doctors and immunologists getting together to discuss the results, and it's basically a committee that recommends whether or not the FDA should grant emergency use authorization to a drug or a treatment. And so it was a bunch of very, very smart people trying to figure out how to use Zoom and constantly reminding each other that they were muted and they had to unmute their microphone. It was funny to watch a bunch of doctors struggle to do conference calls. Um, but it was it was very interesting to see them discuss the results of the vaccine. There were some really interesting parts of it, but I have to say that most of it was really boring. Old people trying to figure out
Use Zoom.
how
Yeah.
Zoom works. So, but the good news of that in November 23rd, just basically just a few days later, um, AstraZeneca reports that they have a vaccine that's 90% effective. Uh, and the FDA grants emergency use authorization for a second antibody treatment, which we might talk about a little bit, but really I think we're kind of more focused on the vaccines. December 11th, the Pfizer BioNTech COVID 19 vaccine meets the statutory requirements for emergency use authorization. And then 7 days later, the Moderna vaccine is approved for emergency use authorization. And that really kickstarted the whole vaccine movement across the country and across the world. The rest of the world
Yeah.
followed very shortly after the FDA said, "Hey, these
Actually,
vaccines
the
are good to go."
UK approved prior to
Did
us.
Pfizer's first. That's right.
Yeah.
You're right. UK got Pfizer's first. We were very shortly after that.
Although the vaccine in China and Russia have been approved long before, but yeah, there's other issues there.
Yeah, they might not necessarily be as world renowned and respected medical bodies of knowledge as the FDA is or the WHO.
uh, Different levels of risk aversion in their testing regimens, let's say.
Probably so. Which is an important point to note that, and we will talk a little bit about this too when we talk about, these clinical trials and what goes into them. But um, yeah, maybe, yeah, different standards for medical practice and testing of new uh, medicines on people in those countries. Um, but that's what I've got as far as the history of it goes. I mean, we're now
Yeah.
December 31st. People are now being vaccinated in this country. Frontline workers starting first. People that are, working with COVID-19 patients directly. And then I think there's a plan to roll it out to elderly and at-risk people, especially in our nursing homes. That those are the people who are dying most commonly from this disease, and where
Yeah.
outbreaks are really happening. So, getting our elderly vaccinated against this is going to be a really, really big step in combating and stopping the deaths from this virus,
Oh,
which is a
100%.
great thing.
Number one thing we can do.
Absolutely.
Um, but yeah, so thanks for taking us through the sort of rough timeline of COVID 19.
Yeah.
But we can also look at, as you mentioned, normally the vaccine development process takes quite a bit longer. And there have been
Yeah.
some awesome frankly, bureaucratic innovations have largely driven why this happened so much more quickly. There are some scientific reasons that this is faster, and we'll get into those too. But honestly, the big reason this was able to happen as quickly as it has is because of just some modern reorganization of the bureaucracy around vaccine approval. And as you mentioned, and credit where credit is due, the funding made available by Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah.
Now, while that didn't directly contribute to the research on the Pfizer vaccine, it did contribute to the testing and approval process in the US.
Yes.
So, as you said and alluded to, the main expense is in vaccines is testing. Testing and after development is huge. There are major problems with sunk cost. So you develop a vaccine, you potentially spend millions, tens of millions of dollars to get the people, the research, the lab works, and then the testing starts happening. And that process historically looked a little bit different. So you start with phase 0. It's a relatively small trial with small doses. You're assuring that there are not extremely harmful reactions to the vaccine. That is phase 0. The Moderna trial, for example, was 45 people in the phase 0 trial. You're not testing the efficacy. You're making sure that it's not going to hurt people from substances or novel combinations of substances in there. You then move on to phase 1. Phase 1 is going to take several months. It's going to have a larger sample size, historically 20 to 80, though in this case larger because of the way they were doing overlapping these testing regimens. But get into that in terms of modification later. Phase 1 is actually focused at some of the longer term effects of dosage. So once again, not efficacy, but like, okay, in small amounts there aren't problems. Tick phase 0. Are there problems with amounts closer to what we expect the necessary dosage to be? Phase 1. So according to the FDA, about 70% of medication passes that phase, which brings you to phase 2. Which now expand again in normal circumstances, so not pandemic vaccine development. And in fact, they tended to increase sample sizes here, which is another thing that all that funds made possible. But several hundred people with the vulnerability or condition are then tested. This is based on the dosages that are determined by phase 0 and 1. So is a small amount harmful? How much can we give people? Let's dial in the dosage. Now let's take some people without underlying comorbidities, but with a vulnerability or with the condition. And only about 33% of medications tend to pass this phase. This phase lasts several months where this is the first point where they're no longer looking just at what are the potential negative effects of this medication on people, but what are the effects of this medication on what it's intended to treat. And that takes
How
us
effective
in.
is it?
Yeah. And that takes us from phase 2 into phase 3. Phase 3 is a much larger treatment group, and this is the actual, like, okay, now let's make sure this thing is ready for people. That group's going to be thousands of people, and the purpose is to actually look at how the medication performs. For medication that's against existing treatment, for new medications or vaccines, that's just performs against making it so people don't get it, right? Like, does it work?
Right.
There's going to be sometimes multiple sample groups. When we hear in the media people talking about the blind or double blind, that's phase 3.
Okay.
That's and not necessarily a procedure that would be used for a vaccine test, by the way. But again, we're just looking at, okay, is this actually effective? Only about 25 to 30% pass this. And although we only ever talk about up through phase 3, there actually is a phase 4 that's part of this. But phase 4 is post approval, when it's being given out to people, actually continuing. It's the ongoing monitoring that the FDA does once a medication is out in public and in the wild. So
Right.
it does not mean the vaccine, like a medicine, is not approved. It's that there is more work after they approve it. They keep making sure it's working and not hurting people.
Yeah, they don't just leave it and forget it, you know. Oh, it's good.
Yeah.
We can just wash our hands of it now. It works. All
Yeah.
right, bye.
With medication, phase 3 tends to be a comparative test against other treatments, but in vaccine development, phase 3 is efficacy and safety rather than that comparison. And the fact is that this is really expensive, right? For
Yeah.
one, you
Yeah.
have all of the money that's already been invested in developing the vaccine, the research or medication, right? The research into the condition, the research into treatment, the testing on animals in the lab, in petri dishes, all of that. And now you have each of these stages of testing. They're all really expensive, and normally if any of them fail, the company that has put out that R&D money, which the discussion around the capitalist motivations of medical development, totally different matter, but in the
Yeah.
system that
Yeah.
exists, if it fails, they have lost everything they've put into it, right?
Yep. Yep.
You have the logistics of testing. You have these people, you need to recruit them, you need to interview them, they need to get medical examinations to make sure that they fit the profile you're looking for. You need to develop that profile. You need to develop testing regimens. All of this stuff costs money. You have to hire people to do these things. You have to secure locations. You have to have personnel to do the recruiting. You often have to pay people for taking part in studies. And then there's
Yeah.
there's all this bureaucratic cost. There's insurance and liability cost because you're about to test medication on people, and if it does go badly, you're gonna have someone has to pay for it, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And with COVID-19, the securing of funding because of things like Operation Warp Speed and other programs in other countries was just not a concern. In fact, but without that, human trials, as I said, very, very, very expensive. And just preparing the protocols for your phase 0 trial and the development, and then looking through phase 3, just the bureaucratic and protocol cost can be around 21 million, right?
Yeah.
Development overall it's just tremendously expensive. There's more sources of this will be in my notes and in the links. But to progress one candidate through the end of trials, you're likely to develop a pandemic vaccine looking at a cost between 2.8 and 3.7 billion dollars with a B,
Wow.
as estimated in
Wow.
2018 in a study done in the Lancet. Because of Operation Warp Speed, because of similar programs, all of that recruitment cost in the U.S. was covered by the government. The
Yeah.
U.S., in fact, helped to handle and provide resources for much of the recruitment of participants. Because for many things, like you said, securing this funding stops a lot of medications from being developed. Because if only 5 people in the world have something, $2 billion is a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then further, this delay happens because normally you have phase 0 to test the smaller dosages, and until phase 0 ends, you don't even start recruiting for phase 1, and then phase 1 happens, and then phase 2, and then phase 3.
Yeah.
That's not how it works here. In fact, once phase 1 they were basically already recruiting for subsequent phases while phases were ongoing. And in some cases, once initial results were good, so once the small study of phase 0 made sure there weren't major adverse reactions, but before it had formally concluded, they were able to start phase 1 because they knew at least in a short term there wouldn't be adverse reactions. So there's this overlap in timeline that hasn't happened historically.
Yeah.
Before phase one ended, phase two had already started. Before phase two had ended, phase three was already well underway because they'd made sure
Hmm.
things were safe enough to at least start. Um, and this is one of the, and then of course the costs were covered. So the companies that were developing these medications didn't have to worry about the sunk cost of this testing if it had failed. And then, especially a
Right.
huge, huge part of the rollout, before phase three was done, the government had made sure that the company's cost of manufacturing dosages, if something proceeded far enough, would be covered even if it then failed. And while that
Hmm.
could have potentially produced millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars in waste, the advantage in speed that it caused, because by the time phase three was done, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of doses could already be prepared to go out to the world. That was a
Yeah.
just that was a huge bureaucratic success.
Yeah.
It looks like this actually follows a lot of recommendations that have been in place and uh, been studied by, interestingly, some organizations that Bill Gates is kind of involved in helping to fund, that have laid out protocols
We
for how
talked
we
about
could
him in
take,
a previous episode.
yeah, modern managerial tactics and modern bureaucratic techniques of partitioning tasks off and siloing them and applying it to vaccine development. And that parallel development process that they put together is largely what ended up being implemented through programs like Operation Warp Speed, and largely what allowed the majority of the process and delay, which was making sure it's safe for humans,
Yeah.
to occur as quickly as it did. Um, so, as I said, like the manufacturer had already started before the end of phase three testing. That was huge. The fact that the
Yeah.
government was going to pay for it, expensive but appropriate and necessary. And that overlap was just huge. It was based on the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, which was based in
Hmm.
Oslo, founded in 2017, so it's relatively
Wow.
recent. They already
Wow.
funded 17 vaccines, but they are who developed a lot of this parallel process for development that,
Hmm.
whether credited directly or not, they're who was putting it out there in terms of getting everything prepared. But of course, it wasn't just the bureaucracy, right? There
Right.
also have been technological developments, um, uh, which have allowed this to happen as quickly as it did. Um, and it kind of comes down to something you referenced a little bit, but SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, is the latest coronavirus. It's not the first. It's
Right.
not the 19th either. Uh,
No.
there have been a number. So the vaccine work done for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 is not pulled out of the ether. It is building upon a lot of work that had already been done on other coronaviruses. Now,
Hmm.
every virus is a little bit different, but they get classified in the same grouping for a reason, and it's because they use similar mechanisms to propagate or attach to us. And if they use similar mechanisms, then they can be interrupted in similar ways. So, that is
Hmm.
not to minimize the research and remarkable work done by the people who worked on COVID 19 specifically, but rather to say all science builds upon other science. But in this case, there was a lot of stuff to build upon.
Right.
So,
Carl, if not to spoil your flow, but this actually kind of segues pretty well into a side point that I was going to try to make. That was a question that I think some very rational people have about, because we were able to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, how come we don't have a vaccine for SARS or MERS or any of these other respiratory illnesses that are very similar to COVID-19 in terms of, their viral makeup. Um, you mind if I dive into that really fast?
No, go for it. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Especially because one of the things I was going to mention as we get into um, mRNA vaccines later is specifically about some similarities to MERS
Nice.
and the S protein that MERS uses for its viral spike. Um,
Ah,
in
cool.
particular, was a similarity that allowed the COVID 19 vaccine development to occur so quickly. One thing I will mention too that I think is fascinating uh, the genome was actually sequenced on January 10th
Holy shit.
for
Wow.
COVID 19. So
Wow. So it gets
only,
announced
yeah,
officially by the WHO.
yeah, just 10 days after the flu was first reported in Wuhan, the genome was already
Wow.
sequenced. And that was also a
Jeez.
huge driver because then they could see the similarities to things like MERS and
Hmm.
help build upon that. So, yeah, I would love to hear too how that point you were looking at relates to that.
Sure. And well, and I won't go into the technical similarities for them or how the structure of the virus necessarily works, but you know, that was something that I had at least had a question about was, how come we don't have vaccines for these other viruses? And it turns out that it's not because we can't do it or we don't know how or we don't have the technology. It's, as we've discussed, there's a myriad of other reasons why vaccines don't get developed like this. So SARS, it was a virus outbreak that many people remember that are our age. It was a big explosive outbreak in 2003. And unfortunately, that outbreak was contained in part because the SARS uh, CoV virus caused severe illness and was less likely to be missed during tracing. And there was no pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic transmission, meaning that if you had it, you knew you had it.
Yeah.
And you had it, and you got symptoms quick. So you
Okay.
weren't walking around spreading this thing around. You were in bed, you know, just suffering. Um, and you didn't just get asymptomatic. You weren't asymptomatic carriers for this. Everybody that got it got sick. So after it was contained, which was very easy to do because, again, you don't have these asymptomatic people walking around spreading the virus, and you couldn't spread it when you didn't have symptoms.
As anyone who's played Plague Incorporated knows, you don't want to add in those serious symptoms before transmission pretty quickly, or your virus gets found out real fast.
Real fast, exactly. So while there were several SARS vaccine candidates that were developed, the funding dried up to test them further. As you mentioned, it's very expensive to do this. Funding dried up, and in addition, there's been no clear pathway for testing the efficacy of the vaccines for SARS and getting it approved for use. Because how can you determine whether a vaccine prevents SARS if there's no SARS to prevent?
Yeah.
So that just makes testing
And
impossible.
why would governments make funding available for something that's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
killing anyone anymore?
Exactly. People aren't getting infected with it, so
Yeah.
there's no point in continuing moving forward with the vaccine because we can't if nobody can get it.
Yeah.
Um, Similarly for MERS, so that was Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, I think. Middle East. I remember the name of it. But it was reported in 2012, and since then there's been spillover events for the virus jumping from the camel reservoir. It spread in camels and into humans, and may transmit directly to humans from camels. Some early MERS outbreaks were pretty explosive, including an exported outbreak in South Korea in 2015. But Saudi Arabia, where the majority of the transmission occurs, has made pretty good improvements to its infection control procedures and prevented hospital spread. And as a result of that, outbreaks of MERS have been very much smaller than those initial outbreaks.
Yeah.
Um, so there are organizations like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI,
Ah, yeah, the same
that
one I
have,
referenced.
yeah,
Yeah.
the one that you referenced. They've been funding research for a MERS vaccine candidate, but the one persistent challenge is identifying strategies to evaluate the efficacy of the vaccine.
Yeah.
Again, along with the other researchers involved, in this, They've discussed how they could potentially do a trial for it, but given the relatively low incidence,
Yeah.
even in high risk groups like people working directly with camels and their families and healthcare workers, your trials need to have at least 100,000 plus participants in order to be effective and get good data, which is not feasible.
Yeah.
There's just not that many people working with camels
Yeah, it's
in
not even a
in the
funding
Middle
issue.
East.
It's just literally there aren't enough people to even have a trial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And yeah, as a result, there's no clear path forward to how you would even test the efficacy of this. So those are some really quick. I found that really interesting. That it's like it's not that we can't do it or we don't have the technology. It's that we can't test it,
Although
and
there
because
probably
we can't
still would
test
be a
it,
funding issue too, because again the population affected is so narrow that that does not
yeah,
make funding flow. But that even further, yeah, I had no idea that it would be there aren't even enough people to do the testing.
yeah, exactly. Um, and one more note I'll point out because another common virus that is we're all very aware of is HIV. And HIV is kind of a uniquely challenging virus, and it's possible that we may never have an actual HIV vaccine for it because the way that it attacks the host immune system. It makes it extremely difficult to design an effective vaccine because it mutates rapidly
Mm.
inside a person's body and diversifies over time. So the viral diversity within a single person has been shown to be comparable with like the viral diversity of influenza across the globe. And because it mutates rapidly inside of a person's body, it becomes much more difficult to get a vaccine that's able to actually target the virus
Yeah.
itself
Yeah.
and prevent it.
Yeah, that's a good call out because I know one thing I've seen as a skeptical comment towards the COVID-19 vaccine is specifically that,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's all these other things that vaccines haven't been developed for and they've been around a lot longer. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, every virus is different though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that kind of goes to the point too. HIV very similar with the flu virus in the way that it mutates. And by comparison, COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus mutates much more slowly than seasonal influenza. Even though we have seen it mutate, compared to other viruses, it mutates much more slowly, meaning
Yeah,
that
just
even
in the
with the
last
mutations,
couple days, there's been a note about another strand showing up, I think, in France. And a
mhm,
month or
UK,
so ago, there was the Danish strand that was infecting the ferret
minks,
population, mink population.
minks,
Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
I need
cute little
some kind of
minks.
long furry-bodied thing.
Yeah, adorable, and we use them for coats, which we really should stop doing that.
Adorable coats. No, no, no.
Adorably warm. I don't know. Free the minks. We had to kill all of them, I guess, to prevent the spread of it. So they killed all the minks in Denmark.
Yeah.
So good humans, we're good. Um, yeah. Anyway, sorry, sad note about the minks, but carry on. I just thought that that was an important little break there to kind of bring that point up.
No, yeah, I think that that is a really good point. I mean, that's a big part of, and I think you're about to cover some more of the innovations in testing and testing procedure that allowed this to go quickly. And then when I get to talk about
Mm.
mRNA, a lot of the stuff's going to come back up again. Um, but yeah, I mean, there are even just coronaviruses. There's hundreds of them. Hundred of them.
Mm.
Yeah, there are hundreds of coronaviruses. Um,
Totally.
They're many of them already sequenced and mapped. And as mentioned, we had MERS, and while they haven't been able to, there's problems with creating the samples, there's problems with funding, but that doesn't change the sequencing research, and that doesn't change the similarities to SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19. And again, in
Mm.
particular, that viruses have a thing called a viral spike,
Yeah.
which is how they attach to our cells and then dump in their mRNA and whatnot to create bat
Hmm.
proteins and propagate themselves. And with MERS, that spike is an S protein, and it happens to be the same mechanism in SARS-CoV-2 that allows it to attach. And as I'll discuss more in the mRNA vaccine section, that meant that they already had a lot of research on how to target the mechanism by which SARS-CoV-2 attaches to our cells, which is necessary for its propagation, which means they already had it at like research done at the base point to prevent it from even ever getting a foothold.
Exactly. And I think it's important to note too, just really quick, that the reason they're called coronaviruses is because that's it's defined by the shape,
Yeah,
right? They're illustrated as little circles with these points coming off them, which are the
the
proteins that
spikes.
you're talking about,
Yeah.
the spikes, protein spikes, and they look like a crown essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So corona crown has nothing to do with the beer. It has everything to do with those protein spikes that stick. That joke got so old so fast this year. Uh,
Yeah, it did.
yeah, it did.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry. I just thought I wanted to point that out. That's where the term coronavirus comes from, is those protein spikes that stick off of it like that, like a crown.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so this we not only have these bureaucratic advancements from the SEPI, we have these technological advancements that allowed modeling to take place more quickly, that previous research allowed more targeted approaches to occur more quickly, and just a lot of things coming together to allow this to happen as quickly as it did. So, again, as we said earlier, quickly does not mean haphazard or rushed at
Right.
all.
Exactly.
Um,
Yep.
it just
Just means fast.
fast. And in this case, as we've seen already, a lot of
Hmm.
efficiency in terms of scheduling and building of the testing procedure, and efficiency in terms of building off of previous knowledge, and just efficacy in terms of how gene modeling has improved and how quickly that can take place. 10 days after the first announced case, genome was mapped, and they were starting to look at
Yeah.
how to target various vaccine techniques.
Amazing.
But as I think you've researched, there also are further advancements in testing and testing procedure that allowed this to accelerate still more. So,
Yeah.
do you want to take us through some
Well,
of that?
sure. I will. And kind of just a kind of stipulation of that point, like when I was researching this, I was looking more from the side of like the approval authorization. Like, what does it take to get FDA to approve any sort of drug or vaccine for use?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I don't think I phrased that entirely accurately.
That's okay. I just wanted to clarify. The FDA, to their credit, again, quickly did not mean haphazardly and that steps were skipped. These vaccines went through the same rigorous analysis process that any drug or vaccine or treatment goes through at the FDA. It's just that in this case, there is a real uh, impetus from a public health perspective to drop everything and have people working almost solely on uh, analyzing the data behind these vaccine trials, getting advisory committees together and discussing, whether or not they're going to be able to approve these or they meet the scientific rigor in order to get approved for use to the American public. So, just a brief, I won't go into all the details of everything the FDA looks at because it's a lot, and you can go look at it online. They list basically a whole document that talks about everything they look at when they're evaluating drugs, clinical trials. They're looking at everything from how the drugs are manufactured, the drug products themselves, the chemistry involved in it. They look at facilities and inspections, anything that's where these drugs are proposed to be made. They look at how the drugs are manufactured, what is the process, where is it manufactured, what are the risks associated with any of that.
Yeah.
They look at non-clinical data, talking about like toxicity studies, characterization of immune responses in animal models,
Yeah.
studies to address the potential for vaccine-associated and enhanced respiratory diseases, any negative impacts that the vaccine could possibly have. They really dive in deep to look at the clinical trials that are being done that are by these companies. So they look at the trial populations. Do you have enough people in your study in order to get actionable data? How are your clinical trials designed? They look at the efficacy results, the statistical considerations, safety considerations, all of that stuff.
I would also like
Um,
to note really quickly, sorry, but
yeah,
that sometimes the way this gets talked about is like it's this utilitarian analysis of what's worse, all this stuff or letting the virus continue to run rampant? And that's not what it is. There is no
Right.
utilitarian thing. It's just when they're considering the things that you're talking about, they're not looking at the harm that could cause relative to continued spread of COVID-19. They're just looking
Right.
at, do these things cause harm? And do these things have
Right.
an unacceptable level of risk? It's not a relative bar, it's a defined bar.
Exactly. The reason for even considering it in the first place is already that risk assessment. What is
Yes.
the risk of not acting on this quickly? Okay, there's a big risk to the public. We do need to act on it quickly and, streamline, move quickly through this
Yeah.
process.
That determines resource allocation, not approval.
100%.
Yeah.
And just to clarify too, like emergency use authorization, I haven't given a definition for that yet, but it's essentially an authority that allows the FDA to help strengthen the nation's public health protections against threats by facilitating the availability use of medical countermeasures needed during a public health emergency. And it's a very specific criteria that they can put out there, and it's essentially under I'll read this. This comes from the FDA's website, but under Section 564 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA commissioner may allow unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of approved medical products to be used in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious life-threatening diseases or conditions caused by threat agents when there are no adequate approved or available alternatives. So, that's kind of the key with that one here is in this case we have a virus that is novel and new. There are no current treatments for it. It is a confirmed global pandemic. There is a national public interest in this, and so therefore, that gives them the ability to authorize the use of these drugs. Now, I think we've just gone into exhaustive detail about what goes into doing these trials, what the FDA looks at in order to say whether or not they can give emergency use authorization to any medication. Yeah, it really is just. I
Yeah.
think you put it really well. It's these are bureaucratic boosts essentially to boost through to speed through the bureaucratic process of getting this done and out
Yeah.
there.
I would also like to know, because sometimes that gets used as like bureaucratic inefficiency. This is. I mean, we did cut out some inefficiencies, but that was done by
Sure.
taking on some level of additional risk by overlapping trials.
Right.
Though that risk was primarily financial, is the thing.
Right.
It was the
Not health risk.
financial
Yeah.
risk of funding additional trials when you knew they were going to be safe for participants, but didn't know they would be successful. Funding the
Right.
initial manufacture of drugs when the trials weren't complete, so you knew it was looking good, but potentially all of that was wasted resource on manufacture, wasted financial resource securing said resources and doing the manufacture. So yes,
Right.
there was additional risk, but the bureaucracy serves to normally mitigate that financial risk. And as we've
Right.
said, the EUA is about some additional risk, financial primarily, in driving the trials,
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
not increased risk level to humans participating.
Exactly. And so I mean, science could always move this fast. We could always do, drug development and approval this quickly if we found a way to overcome the, financial risk
Mm-hmm.
that is what, as we've talked about, really sidelines a lot of, medical advances in vaccines. If
Yeah.
so there's something to be said and a conversation to be had about, the socialization of medicine
Yeah,
and
and the whether or not
yeah,
capitalism is an appropriate model for human health.
yeah. I think both of us have some very similar and strong feelings about that maybe we can go over in a different
Yeah.
episode. But this kind of shows you like this is kind of a best case scenario. Like how fast can we do this? How well can we work together to pull out all the stops and deal with a public health crisis?
Yeah, and we can see when the government essentially removes the financial risk from the companies doing the development, this is how fast it can go. This is
Yeah,
yeah. Um,
yeah, pretty incredible.
Uh,
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the technology
I
essentially behind it? Did you
Yeah,
have any more that you
actually.
wanted to talk about?
Well, I'd like to actually talk about sort of the vaccine we ended up with. Um,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
it is seriously overlapping with technology, but to even talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about two things. What a vaccine does and
Hmm.
what mRNA is.
Ah.
This is pretty basic stuff, right? But I want to make sure that we're
Hmm.
all on the same page, us and all our listener. Um,
Yes.
the so
Listeners.
I said what I meant. Uh, the so a vaccine is historically we would often use some sort of weakened form of the virus or portion of the virus that then
Hmm.
is introduced to your body, such that your very reductive language, which we'll get into more specifics of in the context of mRNA, allows your immune system to be trained to fight the virus, right?
Hmm.
Um, in a be like getting I don't know. I don't even want to come up with an analogy. It's just a weaker form of the virus that lets the immune system fight it, and that will be much more relevant as we talk about mRNA. Um,
Hmm.
mRNA, while we are seeing these are our first approved mRNA vaccines, and that is incredibly exciting. But there are some
Hmm.
people that are making that sound scary. It's getting
Hmm.
described as something that goes in and changes you or alters you or something like that. And
Yeah.
that is not what mRNA does. mRNA is not
Right.
some special new or scary thing. Our ability to create mRNA is awesome and amazing and relatively new. But mRNA, it's in you right now. There's tons of mRNA in you right now. Everyone knows there's DNA in them right now.
Hmm.
So you've got your DNA. Your DNA is your genetic code. Your DNA, generally by the organelles in your cells, then gets transcribed via protein folding. It gets copied and transcribed in sections into RNA. RNA further goes through process in the organelles of your cell, where even smaller sections of RNA are copied. These copied sections, these folded proteins themselves, are messenger ribonucleic acid, as opposed to ribonucleic acid, as opposed to deoxyribonucleic acid. That messenger RNA then floats through you once it's created. It might stay within the cell itself that it was made in, but it can also be passed through the cell walls and go on to other parts of the body. But all that it does is land in an organelle inside a cell and provide instruction for how a protein should be folded. It does not affect your DNA. That is not what it
Hmm.
does. It does not even affect the RNA that has been transcribed and is causing the folding of other messenger RNA that's causing the folding of other proteins. It goes in, it gets consumed kind of in order to tell a part of your cell to make a specific protein. That is all
Right.
mRNA does. It can't change you. It is not genetic engineering. It's
Right.
not CRISPR, right?
Yeah. You're not gene editing here. You're not
Yeah.
editing DNA. Yeah.
It folds a protein and then gets done. It's done.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
mRNA too, doesn't go into the nucleus of a cell. Doesn't penetrate the nucleus if I remember that correctly, because that's the nucleus of your cell is where your DNA is.
Yeah, and then it comes out and as RNA, and that RNA gets passed into messenger RNA, which gets is instructions to fold proteins.
Yeah.
So when we add extra mRNA, we're really just adding a batch. It's like a batch order
Yeah.
for your body to manufacture some proteins, and then
Hmm.
when it's done, that's it.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell your body to change its RNA to change future orders for protein manufacture.
Right.
It just makes a protein and then it gets used up.
Yep.
And I guess that brings us also to what I'd like to talk about, which is what a virus is.
Yeah.
Um, at a very high, and so I mean that's I know it's very freshman bio, high school freshman bio, right?
Totally. Totally.
But want to be on the same page so we can talk about how absurd some of these allegations that somehow it being an mRNA vaccine is dangerous or scary.
Yeah. Full disclosure, Carl, I got a C in like high school biology and chemistry. So I am you're the more qualified one to talk about all this stuff. So I'm
Oh,
glad that you're taking
I
the reins on this.
I guess that I also took AP, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, toot my horn. Okay, but so viruses aren't creatures. They're not alive by any conventional definition. As you mentioned when we were talking about what a coronavirus is, viruses in general are basically just an RNA strand wrapped in some proteins. Um, that RNA strand wrapped in those proteins goes into a creature, an actual living being, attaches to a cell, injects some mRNA. That mRNA that the virus injects instructs the cell to fold proteins into more of the virus.
Yep.
That's
Replicate.
what a virus does.
Yep.
That's how it's replicating. So when we're talking about an mRNA vaccine versus a regular vaccine, while an mRNA vaccine is new and amazing and its potential is phenomenal, at a very reductive level, it's not really different than traditional vaccines. It's just that we have the ability now to fully manufacture mRNA instead of trying to either the oldest method weaken a virus and then actually introduce that virus in a weakened form, which hopefully will have less symptoms, into the human body so that then it exposes itself to your immune system, which picks up on these foreign proteins and creates blockages. But
Yeah.
in that case, we're doing it by introducing the entire fucking virus into you. Like,
Yeah.
there's a reason why early vaccines had the potential to make people sick.
Right.
Because breeding a weakened virus is tough. That's a complex process with a high potential margin for error. If your mutated weak strain mutates again, it can become bad. And then we have the slightly newer method where we would, I mean, when we're talking about things this small, this is almost metaphorical, but
Yeah.
chop off sections of the virus. So we'd cut out sections of viral DNA or viral RNA, sorry, in order to use those chopped sections to create the less harmful parts of the protein to introduce to the body. But there again, it's still parts of the actual virus. And when you're talking about chopping RNA, like, there's a lot of extra sections. mRNA vaccines are essentially the next logical step. Instead of trying to amputate a section of RNA off the virus or breed some sort of reduced virus, we just manufacture our own RNA, messenger RNA, that instructs the body to create the protein which we identified when sequencing the genome of the virus that will stop it. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, that was building upon the research into MERS, finding that there's this S protein that is the viral spike, which is how the virus attaches to our cells, which is how it then is able to inject its harmful messenger RNA to instruct its own replication.
Right.
And instead, we have just our own mRNA that artificially manufactures just the S protein, just the viral spike, not the rest of the virus.
The
And
spike
so,
sticking out of the crown. Yep.
yep. And because now we've sent a bunch of mRNA batch instructions for your body to fold a bunch of S proteins, now you've got a bunch of that S protein in you, which will be found by your immune system process, which will then
Helper T cells. I remember that one.
it helps your T cells to fold new T cells, fold new proteins that can block the receptors that would normally allow the S protein to attach. So far from being more dangerous, mRNA vaccines have by far and away the potential to be less dangerous. There is no danger of having a weakened virus in you that could mutate because there's no virus in you. There's just just the messenger RNA. There is no danger of having the chopped off portion of the virus that is, again, a difficult and hard process that could include parts that were still harmful, because literally the only thing being replicated is just the viral spike.
Yep.
That's
Exactly.
it. And it's amazing that we can do this.
Yeah.
This is like, so we have the viruses, they're not really alive, and instead we're just manufacturing mRNA and inserting it. So
Yeah.
that is why we don't need to be scared because there's an acronym.
Yeah. Or just
I think acronym. Are acronyms pronounceable?
sure. Yeah.
What,
I think that's it.
whatever.
We didn't research that topic.
We don't need to worry about the mRNA itself.
Right.
It's not part of a virus. It's not a weakened virus. It just allows instructions to fold the S protein to allow your immune system to learn to block the S protein and thus cut COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 off, because if it can't attach to your cells, it
Yeah.
can't inject its RNA. If it can't inject its RNA, it can't replicate.
Right.
That's
There you go.
Yeah.
Now you're vaccinated. And I think it's important to note too that mRNA is very fragile, very sensitive.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
it breaks
incredibly.
down real quick.
That's why we know the Moderna vaccine, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
the two-phase one, has to be transported at like negative 95 degrees Fahrenheit.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where they're actually. So we know that it being an mRNA vaccine is not scary. At worst, it's going to just make some proteins in you, and then it'll get used up and be done. But, oh my God, it's a new vaccine. Has it really been tested? What else could be harmful in it? And, I mean, the answer to that question is stuff that, even though it's the first mRNA vaccine, the answer is still stuff that's in lots of other vaccines. So we already know the effects of most of these things on people, which is
Right.
another reason why this is able to go so quickly. I mean, if you know the effect of an ingredient in people's bodies and then that ingredient's in a thing, you don't have to test that ingredient. It's been tested.
Right.
And so what goes into the mRNA vaccine? Well, there's the mRNA, which, again, is gonna make your body fold some S proteins in this case.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
immune system will fight them. It's definitively harmless because it's not even a weakened virus, yada, yada.
Yeah.
That mRNA, because it's unstable, as you mentioned, does have to be encased in microlipids. Lipids are fats, for our listener. Sorry.
Sirs.
And potentially people could be allergic to these, but it's publicly available what they are, and we can consult our doctor and whatnot. But the lipids include, but I don't think are limited. You know what? They'll be in the notes. They're things like, oh man, 2 polyethylene glycol 2000 ditetradecylacetamide.
Woof. That's a scary
And then
sounding word.
There's 2 others with similarly long names. They're just microlipids, though.
Just scary to pronounce, not scary in
Oh,
general.
it's scary as heck to pronounce. And potentially, though, I mean, there are people that are allergic to lipids, and those people that are allergic to those lipids may not be able to take this vaccine. Although some of the testing has indicated that even then, I mean, they're microlipids. They're very, very, not a lot. It's very little. You'd have to be very, 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 very allergic to these things for it to be a problem. This is
Yeah.
going to be a very small fraction of a percentage of the population.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't even
Much-
know if there's enough that you could be devastatingly allergic.
I'm sure we'll find out. I mean, with millions and millions of people across the globe getting
Hundreds of
vaccinated
millions
by
are gonna
these,
get it.
hundreds
Yeah.
of millions. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
figure it out. News for them
Hopefully
is
billions.
that, like, hopefully billions. The good news for those people is that there are other vaccines that are in development right now that are more
Yeah.
traditional style vaccines. Like Johnson and Johnson's vaccine is a modified. I looked into this a little bit just because I thought it was interesting. It's not an mRNA vaccine, but it's a modified adenovirus that behaves a little bit more like a traditional viral vaccine. But basically, it's a virus that they've modified to instruct the cell to create those spike proteins.
Yeah.
but also uses DNA instead of RNA, so it's much more stable.
Okay.
Um,
Oh,
but
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It'll still have to probably be encased in. Well, and there will be other people that'll be allergic to some things. That's
sure,
why herd immunity is important, because some people just won't be able to get any of them.
absolutely
Um,
right.
the mRNA vaccines also include some potassium chloride, monobasic potassium sulfate, sodium chloride, dibasic sodium phosphate dihydrate, and sucrose, sugar. I know
Ah,
the last one. It's
I
sugar.
knew that one.
And sodium chloride. I know that one too.
I got a C in chemistry,
Salt.
but I got that one.
Uh, but so yeah, I mean, it's just that's the thing. We know what those things do to people, so that's another reason why when people say, "Oh, but it's this new vaccine, and how do we know what this new vaccine impacts will have long term?" It's
Hmm.
like, well, yeah, it is a new vaccine,
Yeah,
but it's a new vaccine made out of stuff that we already know what it does to people.
and how it
So
works. Yeah,
yeah, it's not like an entirely new compound, and we have no idea what the effect of it will be long term on human beings. It's
right.
made of stuff that we know what it does.
Yeah,
Again, we have the mRNA, which is not a partial virus. It's not a weakened virus. It is simply an engineered instruction to fold a protein that on its own is not harmful so that your body can learn to prevent that spike protein from being effective.
hmm,
Learn.
yeah,
Create the proteins to block it.
yeah, yeah. It is kind of learning in a way. It's good. It's taking
Yeah,
instructions. Um,
well, creating other chemical compounds that can block the S protein from
yes,
attaching.
yes.
Um, and because of this ability to manufacture mRNA now, and because we can it basically means that if we could find a protein that could stop something from being a problem,
Hmm,
these mRNA vaccines have phenomenal potential.
hmm.
They can even prevent some cancers
Mm,
because there's some cancers that are caused by specific protein irregularities, and we could in advance you could teach the immune system to fight off that irregular protein
wow.
because we don't need to find a virus, we don't need to cut a virus, we just need to develop an mRNA that makes the body fold this specific protein.
Yeah,
That's all.
that's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, they can affect multiple viruses at once. I mean, if MERS
Hmm.
and SARS-CoV-2 both use the S protein, well, then this vaccine will also prevent MERS.
Wow.
Unless you get a major, major mutation that changes the viral attachment.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but it does have that problem of the storability and shelf life, which
yeah.
has serious logistical impacts. mRNA has to be contained in these little microlipids, which some people may be allergic to and may produce some local swelling, even in the face of. Initial testing indicates that this will not be a problem, even for people with allergies, based on some of the studies that are linked in my research and that I read. But there's 6 billion, almost 7 billion, over 7 billion humans.
God.
And we hope that at least 80 or so percent of them will get the vaccine.
Yes.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, someone may have an allergic reaction. But it is this remarkable confluence of bureaucratic improvements,
Yeah.
technological improvements, testing improvements, procedural improvements, resource allocation, building upon previous research, and things like CEPI coming into existence and promoting these bureaucratic achievements just a few years ago.
Yeah.
So that we have this model available. And mRNA manufacture hitting a point within really just the last 5 to 10 years tops where it's even possible to mass manufacture mRNA in order to produce the volumes required to create a vaccine based on it. That all of this has come together to mean that while we are facing this horrific pandemic, that the research is at a point and this global cooperative effort is at a point where this was able to be produced quickly and tested rigorously, even though it was quick,
Yeah.
so that now we have access to a vaccine and hopefully in less than a year and a half,
Yeah.
a widespread vaccine deployment where life's able to start returning to pre COVID-19
Yeah. God, that would be nice.
non-pandemic status.
Non-pandemic status. That would be really nice to go eat in a restaurant again.
Or fly on a plane.
Fly on a plane. Visit a
Well, not
friend.
fly on a plane, but go somewhere
Yeah.
that requires a plane to get
Yeah.
there.
Exactly. And I mean, it's not that people aren't doing that now, just, there's a lot of
No.
safety measures that you have to take if you're trying to be responsible.
Well, yeah, and I mean, not to say that many people don't have a choice if they're traveling or not right now because of
Yeah.
either work or other emergency situations. Though I would uh, happily throw shade upon those who are fully voluntarily choosing to engage in such high risk behavior.
Yeah. Not great, guys. Don't do that. Um, I think it's good to point out too that I want to just talk really quick about one of the conspiracy theories that I heard about the mRNA, in that it creates a protein similar to a protein that's created by the uterus when a woman gets pregnant, and therefore will
Oh
make women
yeah,
sterile. It doesn't do that. It doesn't alter DNA.
no,
It doesn't. It's not.
no,
And they're not the same protein. So
no, they're not the same protein.
exactly.
And frankly, even if okay, it does not. Even if you injected someone with mRNA that contained a protein that had some potential side effects by that protein being in your system,
Hmm.
your body will not continue to manufacture the mRNA that is in the vaccine.
Right.
That is not a thing that will happen because, as we both mentioned repeatedly, it does not change your DNA, it does not change your RNA. Thus,
Yep.
once the mRNA from the vaccine is gone, it's gone forever. And once it's gone forever, your body cannot continue to manufacture said protein.
Hmm.
So, said protein will work its way out of your system,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
that'll be it.
And that'll be that.
And frankly, even if there were some virus that used the same protein mechanisms by which an embryo attached to the uterine wall, it would destroy the species.
Yeah.
Be
It would have already. Yeah. Um,
no, that's
yeah.
that's just no, and it's not a single protein. I don't think. I don't know. I haven't
No.
researched that.
Uh,
I
it-
can't imagine it. It is a one protein situation by which the embryo attaches to the uterine wall.
Seems a little bit. Yeah. Seems a little bit simplified by people who know a little bit and maybe don't know enough. So, well, buddy,
Yeah.
we did pretty good on this. Do you have any last thoughts?
No. Just look. I look. Just because someone is skeptical about a vaccine,
Hmm.
especially in the face of some of the insane politics that have been going on this year,
Yeah.
it does not make them an anti-vaxxer.
Right. Right.
But I would encourage folks to do their research.
Yes.
Haha. That's
Yes.
the title
You
of
could
the
listen to this
podcast.
podcast if you want. We did a lot of it.
And I think you can see that while healthy skepticism is important, in this case, fast did not mean haphazard.
Yes.
Fast did not mean rushed. Fast simply meant efficient.
Right.
And while there was some additional risk taken on by proceeding this quickly, that risk is financial. And
Yes.
that financial risk for the companies was mitigated through government funding and assistance.
Yes.
So fast is not haphazard. Shortcuts were not taken to ensure that this thing was safe. And in terms of worry about long-term issues, it's made up of stuff that we know what it does, and
Right.
it's not. Yeah, we're not introducing some brand new molecule that was made in the Hadron Collider. This is a
Exactly.
bunch of stuff that is in our bodies, and we know what it does.
Yeah.
Sucrose, and yeah.
Yeah.
So please, if it's safe for you, please
Yeah.
get vaccinated when you
Yeah,
can.
we're not medical doctors, and we're not giving medical advice here, and we're not your doctor. But I just
Yeah.
I feel confident as a layperson who has no medical formal training to say that if you have an opportunity to get vaccinated when the time comes, I hope you consider doing it, because I absolutely will. The first chance I get,
Yeah.
definitely going to do it. We got to protect the
Mm-hmm.
people we care about, and we got to protect our society and the rest of the folks around that maybe can't get vaccinated. We have to get that herd
Yeah.
immunity that you talked about.
I mean, yeah, we already have children making up 20%. There will be some percentage of the population that is legitimately allergic to some
Yeah,
of these things. As you mentioned through testing, it's not, pregnant people are not told not to take the vaccine,
right.
but like there's things that haven't been tested. And like everyone who can should, though they should consult their own physician if they have allergy concerns or other such
Absolutely.
things. But like, fast was not haphazard.
Right.
This thing has followed the normal vaccine development process. It's just been allowed to occur really, really, really quickly because resources were able to be made available because of the gigantic impact to the globe. Capitalism couldn't slow this one down.
Exactly. Well, here's hoping that everything goes great with the vaccine rollout and we can get enough people protected in time that we can avoid, any more hopefully unnecessary deaths at this point. So maybe
Yeah,
this time next year, we can be doing this podcast in person.
maybe,
That'd be great.
maybe
I'd love that.
that would. Yeah.
All right, buddy. Well, any final words?
No, just thanks to our listener, and yeah, please, if anyone has feedback for us, let us know, and look forward to our next topic, whatever it may be. Also, if anyone has suggested topics, feel free to reach
Yes.
out to us or comment.
Shout us out. Comment in the video. So, all right. Everybody, take care of each other. Carl, you take care too, buddy.
Thanks, man. You too.
All right. Till next time.
Thanks, everybody. Next time.